Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hunter Stiers, non-resident fellow with the Navy League Center for Maritime Strategy and the project director of the U.S. Naval Institute's Maritime Counterinsurgency Project. We have a number of panels here at Sea Air Space focusing on our efforts to prepare for a possible future high-end war in the Indo-Pacific. That work is very important. Our conversation here is going to be a bit different. We are going to focus on how the U.S. Sea Services and the State Department are working with allies and partners to address the very real challenges that China is posing to our national interests right now, below the threshold of armed conflict. To briefly set the table for our discussion, at the center of this problem is China's campaign throughout the Indo-Pacific to undermine and ultimately overturn the prevailing international legal order that upholds the freedom of the state. This is a foundational U.S. national interest for which our country has gone to war no less than 6 times. To realize its revisionist aims, China is not seeking out a conventional force-on-force decisive battle with the U.S. Navy and our partners. Instead, the central front in this campaign is China's forcible coercion of local civilian mariners in places like the South China Sea. It bears emphasis that half the world's fishing fleet operates in the South China Sea. Millions of people depend on access to the South China Sea for their daily livelihoods. And this large civilian population is being subjected to a campaign of intimidation and harassment. Chinese maritime militia forces, and indeed its Coast Guard, will steal fishermen's catch. They will confiscate radios and navigational equipment essential to safe operations at sea. They will pour gasoline into civilians' supplies of drinking water to compel fishermen to return to shore. Chinese forces will kidnap Vietnamese fishermen for ransom, and they will fire upon, ram, and sink civilian vessels, often leaving their crews in the water to drown. Let me say that again. They will fire upon, ram, and sink civilian vessels, often leaving their crews in the water to drown. This is an outrageous desecration of the most foundational rules governing conduct among mariners. Regardless of whether these acts of systematic maritime barbarism constitute a form of state piracy, Beijing's strategic objective is clear. Rather than seek to undo the freedom of the sea by war, China is trying to circumvent us in the gray zone, to cumulatively and coercively impose its will on the civilians who dwell in the places that Beijing wishes to make its own. This type of strategy has a name. It's called an insurgency. This one just so happens to be a maritime insurgency. Preparing for the high-end fight remains important, but it is insufficient to achieve victory by itself. China is waging a dual-track strategy. They are preparing for possible future war while working to win without fighting today. We don't have the luxury of choosing our preferred threat. We must counter both these lines of effort. Thankfully, there's growing energy around mobilizing our intellectual capital to develop actionable strategies to address this comprehensive challenge. In January 2022, the Navy League founded the Center for Maritime Strategy to create an intellectual home for scholars and advocates working to deepen understanding and broaden awareness of the importance of sea power to our nation's security. And starting in the July 2022 issue of Proceedings, the U.S. Naval Institute launched the Maritime Counterinsurgency Project, an initiative that is bringing the world's preeminent maritime strategists to formulate, in the open and in real time, a cohesive new approach for the United States and our allies to counter China's campaign to dominate the South China Sea. The project builds on a highly successful prototype operational implementation of the maritime counterinsurgency concept by the 7th Fleet's Task Force 76 in the West Capella standoff a few years ago. And it's worth noting that these efforts have driven some very interesting reactions in both the Allied as well as the Chinese information space. Both our friends and our competitors have noticed and are taking this work seriously. Today, we are most fortunate to be convening some of the key leaders who are spearheading our nation's efforts alongside our allies and partners throughout the Indo-Pacific to enable us to prevail without fighting. Going down the line here, we have Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, Camille Dawson, We have Vice Admiral Eugene Black, OpNav N3 and 5, Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Operations, Plans, and Strategy. We have Vice Admiral Andrew Tiongson, Commander of U.S. Coast Guard Pacific Area. Brigadier General Simon Duran, Director of Strategy and Plans at Headquarters Marine Corps. And we have Professor James Holmes, one of the foremost maritime strategists in the world, who holds the J.C. Wiley Chair of Maritime Strategy at the U.S. Naval War College. Professor Holmes, I'd like to start with you. In your lead article for the launch of the Maritime Coin Project in the July 2022 issue of Proceedings, you have to be there, it's on page 34 of your July issue, for those of you who have that copy at home for you to go back and reference. In that article, you offer some timeless principles that should guide our actions as we seek to develop a U.S. and allied strategy to defend freedom of the seas and the rule of international law in the South China Sea. Could you give our audience a better understanding of the nature of the Chinese gray zone challenge, and how should we be thinking and focusing our efforts so that we can win without fighting?
Thanks, Hunter. I want everybody to undertake an active imagination this afternoon. Imagine how the situation in the South China Sea looks through the eyes of a Philippine or Vietnamese fisherman, Coast Guardsman, or sailor. It looks grim. In order to succeed, we need to make things look less grim to these people. Our strategic goal should be to give Southeast Asian mariners heart in the face of communist Chinese coercion. We should strive to give that fisherman the confidence to go out and make a living for himself and his family without undue fear of abuse at the hands of a domineering coastal state that's asserting itself unlawfully but effectively in defiance of international law. Now imagine what that fisherman sees around himself on a daily basis. He sees the Chinese fishing fleet, the militia embedded in it, and the world's largest Coast Guard, all backed up by the PLA Navy and shore-based aircraft and missiles. This force utterly outmatches his Coast Guard and his Navy, his ostensible protectors. A U.S. Navy task force puts in an appearance once in a while and looks impressive, only to soon steam away, leaving Chinese maritime forces in possession of disputed waters and skies. Our mariner is once again subject to that abuse that we want to guard against. He could well be disheartened, and our strategy will have fallen short of its goal. So my basic insight today is very basic. You have to step onto the field of competition and stay there for the duration of the contest if you hope to prevail. It's the same principle as in sports. I doubt my Georgia Bulldogs would have won 2 national championships straight had they only shown up on the field once in a while to display their awesomeness. Same goes, I would say, for UConn and San Diego State tonight on the court. Similarly, come-and-go operations such as FONOPS and military exercises are helpful in many ways, but they apply a feeble deterrent at best in the gray zone. To embolden that fisherman to ply his trade and to empower his nation to exercise its sovereign rights at sea, we and our partners need to stage a constant presence in force. Coming and going is not enough. We have to go and stay. That's what Admiral J.C. Wiley was trying to convey in his book, Military Strategy, when he proclaimed that the man on the scene with a gun, the soldier, marine, or sailor toting superior firepower, is the final arbiter of who controls something. And controlling something is the goal of military strategy in wartime and peacetime alike. Control is how you win. And it's only prudent to try to control that something, in this case, maritime geographic space, with the least violence possible, preferably none at all. Our Chinese friends are always talking about winning without fighting, but make no mistake, aggressors love peace. As Clausewitz teaches and as Chinese strategists confirm, they would love for the aggrieved to give up without a fight and save China all the dangers, costs, and hardships entailed by warfare. Never forget that win takes precedence over without fighting in that simple formula, or that peace is war without bloodshed for China. Now, we can win without fighting if we convince our opponent, our allies, and our partners, and third parties able to influence the outcome of the competition that we would win with fighting if it came to that. If we make that absolutely clear to all parties, our opponent should scale back its provocations as a losing effort, and the region can de-escalate to beneath the gray zone. Allies and partners would gain the confidence to stand up for themselves. I doubt we can deter China for all time, given the importance it attaches to its claims to indisputable sovereignty over regional waters and land masses, but we may be able to deter it day by day. That may be the best we can do. And who knows, good things may happen if we can do that long enough. As far as what kinds of forces we should stage in the region in order to compete to good effect, This is a law enforcement challenge as much as it is a military challenge. It's about sovereignty, meaning who makes the rules and where. So in a sense, we should take a page from China's book and make Coast Guards, law enforcement services, and light naval forces our implements of choice, backing them up with heavier naval forces and shore fire support should things go sideways in the region. That's why recent news of our return to the Philippines is so welcome, as are reports that multinational Coast Guard patrols may soon take to the sea. So let's experiment with how to harness joint and combined maritime forces along with geography for strategic and political gain, emboldening our hypothetical fishermen.
Thank you, Dr. Holmes. The other week, you published an article in 1945 examining the recently released Joint Concept for Competing. Tell us a bit more about your reactions to that document, and where do we need to go from here as we seek to better develop our understanding of maritime competition in joint and service doctrine?
Thanks. I'm going to be a little bit like President Truman's three-handed economist who's always talking about something on the other hand. And I'm going to alternate between critique and praise and then back again to critique of the joint concept for competing. My general critique was that it's hard to judge the concept from what you see on the page. If you haven't read it, it's well worth your time and it's out there online. It describes itself as adversary agnostic, prescribing a general approach for the joint force to integrate its efforts with fellow U.S. government agencies and foreign partners to face down gray zone aggression. It's not tailored to any theater or competitor, and thus it feels unmoored from strategic and operational reality. It's also service agnostic, treating the joint force as an undifferentiated unit rather than an alliance of supported and supporting arms of maritime might that play their parts in different proportions according to the contingency. And it reads as though it's all about us. It's all about, or it's much like capabilities-based planning and other abstract approaches that seem to ignore the fact that the adversary gets a vote in the success of our strategy and will undoubtedly try to veto that strategy. It's all about what we intend to do rather than how we will interact with friends, partners, and potential foes to get our way. In that sense, it feels astrategic, if that's a word, neglecting the interactive nature of human affairs. But don't get me wrong, and here's the first swerve. There is much goodness here in the document. Strategic competition is a curious beast. Challengers compete for the highest of stakes. And in fact, in the South China Sea, the stakes could hardly be higher. The nature of the international maritime order, as codified in the law of the sea, is at issue. And yet, Beijing deploys minimal means in hopes of accomplishing these grand aims over time. And time is the key. China is prosecuting what Admiral Wiley calls a cumulative campaign, an effort that chips away at an antagonist by conducting small-scale tactical actions unrelated to one another in place or in time. None of these actions amounts to much on its own, but many small things can add up to something big over time, which is the basic idea. It takes time to wear down an adversary bit by bit. Although the joint concept for competing does not couch things in quite such theoretical terms, the notion that we confront a strategy of gradualism in the South China Sea and elsewhere comes through clearly in the document. That is a tonic for those of us who are used to thinking in terms of a sharp divide between war and peace. That being said, let me swerve one more time back to critique. One thing that does worry me about the document is that despite describing competition as a seamless continuum, it still makes it sound as though the Pentagon sees an either-or trade-off between competing strategically and preparing for war. It talks repeatedly about the opportunity costs of competing in terms of operational readiness. It seems to say that if we are competing, we are not preparing for war. But as George Washington advised, riffing on the ancients, such as Vegetius, if you want peace, prepare for war. I would only add that if you prepare for war in such a way that you impress upon all parties able to influence the outcome of a competition that you would win if a dispute were to come to blows, you may gain a strategic advantage, which is really what it's all about. So readiness is competing if we do it right. China must be able to harbor no doubt about our capability and our resolve to use our capability under conditions we say that we will in order to get our way and balk China's will. So in the end, I'm reserving judgment about the joint concept. We simply don't know enough right now to reach a firm verdict on it. I suspect this umbrella document will be followed up by a series of directives tailored to various theaters and competitors, providing the concreteness the concept needs to be actionable. For instance, one would imagine that the sea services, including the U.S. Coast Guard, backed up by the Navy and ground-based implements of sea power, will be the lead services in the South China Sea. That division of labor might be quite different from elsewhere on the map. Once we have that family of documents, we may be onto something.
Thank you, Dr. Holmes. Admiral Black, I'd like to go to you next. You're coming from to N3 and 5 from 6th Fleet in Naval Forces Europe and Naval Forces Africa, regions which face a number of similar challenges as those posed by China's maritime insurgency in the South China Sea. I particularly appreciate how you discuss strategic competition in your 6th Fleet cardinal directions, and I'll just share it with the group here, that competition is not permanently won or lost, it's the score on any given day that matters. Could you speak to how you're applying your recent experience in the fleet to maritime competition in the Indo-Pacific as part of your new portfolio at N3 and 5?
Well, thank you, Hunter, for inviting me, and also for actually reading the cardinal directions. It's remarkably rare. But I very much appreciate the homework you did in preparing for this. There's a follow-on quote that I think really hits the essence of it. To deter aggression against the U.S. and allies, we will consistently operate maritime forces forward. That's true in the European theater. It's true in the Pacific theater. It's true in the Arctic. It's true on every water that ships and aircraft and submarines can sail, steam, and fly. And that's how we will compete. The free and open Indo-Pacific, the free and open Atlantic, the free and open Indian Ocean, it's the same. The mission is the same. The challengers are different. And we're meeting them, as the professor so eloquently says, we probably have to meet them in different ways. But it's a rare day that we're not speaking with allies, and it's a rare day that we're not operating with allies and partners. I was in a meeting this morning, and the chairman noted a statistic that I hadn't heard before. There were 50 exercises a week across the joint force, across the globe. That's a pretty remarkable effort. That's a pretty remarkable ability to work together. And we go from the large exercises, the RIMPACs, the ball tops, down to the smaller, more local ones, all the way down to the PASEX, where two ships meet, exchange signals, perhaps do some stationing, and move on. And it happens every day. But the manifestation of that is in crisis. When ships meet, they come together and they operate, just as I witnessed in the 6th Fleet. As the Russian ships came down from their northern fleet, and we were tasked to stay on station with them, it was incredibly gratifying to have our NATO partners sailing alongside us. And at every instance, we could join, exchange signals, operate together, support each other logistically. And I would submit it was the rare picture that didn't have, if there was a Russian ship in it, there's also a NATO ship as well. That, to me, gets to the heart of what we do every day. The strength of NATO reaches into the Pacific. We have Germany deployed to the Indo-Pacific. We have France deploying to the Indo-Pacific, the Royal Navy from the UK. And we, in fact, have NATO Pacific partners. Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea. It's a remarkable group of like-minded nations that gather. But the mission is daunting, as the professor so eloquently describes. And we've got work to do. We've got work to do. We've got some old habits of overclassification and overly complicating fairly simple things that luckily, as the competition grows more sharp, we are getting after those things. No one would have predicted the reaction of the NATO alliance with the threat from Ukraine, and certainly in the maritime it came together in a way I hadn't seen in 37 years at sea. And so I'm heartened and excited for what the future holds as we continue to compete.
Thank you, Admiral. Now, this past year's NDAA formally codified in Title 10 the Navy's unique and foundational mission for naval diplomacy and competition below the threshold of armed conflict. And this new language requires that the Navy be organized, manned, trained, and equipped, and I quote here, for the peacetime promotion of the national security interests and prosperity of the United States. And as CNO Gilday said just this past week in his testimony on the Hill, though the mission statement is new, The mission itself is not. How are you thinking about this updated mission statement, and how are you looking to incorporate it into your responsibilities as N3 and 5?
I think Congress did a great service by capturing in law the missions of state that we've been performing since 1775. And the peacetime prosperity, to me, that translates into a free flow of maritime, free flow of goods and services across the maritime, all across the world. You know, you can quote the number, 90%, 95%, pick one. It doesn't really matter. The lifeblood, the economies of the world run on the maritime, and the presence that the U.S. Navy and the Marines and the Coast Guard bring to the maritime commons to ensure the free flow of that commerce is a part of that. You know, the Navy was founded, or the Continental Navy, in 1775, and then, you know, it had a resurgence at the turn of the 19th century. Forgive me if I'm butchering history, Professor. But the Barbary pirates brought us back to sea, and multiple conflicts, and then piracy in the 21st century kept us at sea. And how do you fight that? With presence. But that missions of state that the U.S. Navy performs, an example that just sticks in my mind, and it's also a great example of the Navy Marine Corps team. The 500th birthday of the Swedish Navy this summer, and who is anchored in the middle of Stockholm Harbor, USS Kearsarge, and we are there together to celebrate the 500th birthday of Sweden, who at the time had applied to join NATO and is under considerable pressure from those who would oppose us. And that, to me, is a classic mission of state. There's not a captain of a ship out there that hasn't hosted a reception. And it's kind of a thrill to have the ambassador of whatever port you pull into come aboard under the Stars and Stripes and host people that he or she deems important to our relationships, and they get to see our ships, they get to see a little piece of our society, but more importantly, they get to see our sailors and Marines, and they begin to understand the strength of the idea and all that the Navy and what those sailors stand for. So I think the Congress did a great service, and I'm glad we captured it in law, Hunter. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral. Admiral Tiongson, I'd like to go to you next. Admiral, Coast Guard Pacific Area, under your command, has embarked on some exciting new initiatives in the Western Pacific. Could you share a bit more about how is the Coast Guard expanding its presence and operations in the region?
Sure, thanks. First, I want to thank CR and Space for holding this important panel. And Hunter, I appreciate the question. I'm glad you gave me 30 minutes to answer it. So, first, I want to define the region a little bit. I want to think about the region broadly, from Hawaii up to and including the South China Sea. So that's my frame of reference when I talk about the region. And as you know, we have been in this region. Our presence has and will still be in there. It's enduring. Obviously, there's more emphasis in the region, and it's renewed national commitment, right? So many of us that are sitting here, we've all seen the most recent White House's Indo-Pacific strategy. It specifically calls out in there growing U.S. Coast Guard presence to enhance maritime security across the Indo-Pacific, primarily through advising, training, and building partner capacity. In my mind, in order to really understand that, we need to make sure we have two factors in our head. First, the Commandant said it earlier this morning. She said, we are a global Coast Guard. We are a global Coast Guard. The second piece is our value proposition, not only to the men and women of our country, but also to the world, is maritime governance. You know, we have broad authorities and we have broad missions. We're an armed service, an LE agency, law enforcement agency, a regulatory agency, a member of the intel community, and a humanitarian service. You know all that, but what does that translate to? Think in terms of fisheries enforcement, port security, ensuring safe and secure commerce, search and rescue, HADR, environmental protection, all of these things, maritime governance. And some would argue that that's what we need. That's what we need throughout the world. Examples of how we are expanding this Coast Guard presence and operations, I'm going to start with enablers. So we have several types of enablers that are out there. The first one I want to talk about is bilateral agreements or shipwriter agreements. We have 12, and the list is growing throughout that region that enable us to conduct combined fisheries enforcements with the partner nation in order to help the sovereign rights of those partners in their exclusive economic zone. We have various fora for multilateral engagements. All of these are focused on some form of the maritime governance that I just defined with the various mission sets. Think about the North Pacific Coast Guard Forum, the Pacific Islands Forum for Fisheries, Fisheries Agency, that's FFA, the Pacific Quad, Southeast Asia Maritime Law Enforcement Initiative, regional fisheries management organizations, the list goes on. The U.S. Coast Guard is a key player in all of those multilateral engagements. Another enabler that's helping us a lot, and we're growing in that space as well, are our attachés and liaisons, our regional advisors throughout the Indo-Pacific. So not many people know this. We have Coast Guard attachés in Australia, Taiwan, Russia, Singapore, Korea, Japan. We're trying to grow that. Coast Guard liaison officers, we got them in Fiji, Philippines, ASEAN, at the joint headquarters in Australia, and we have a maritime advisor in Vietnam. But really, when you asked your question, everybody wants to hear about hardware. What are we doing about hardware? Well, we're doing more there as well. So this year, we've increased our national security cutter deployments in support of the Navy's PAC fleet, 7th Fleet that's out there, in order to assist or support their operations and their exercises. We also use those to conduct our own operations and exercises with partner nations. So think about interoperability exercises with partner nations. Think about countering IUU fish. Think about search and rescue, those types of things that we're out and about doing it. We're pushing our fast response cutters, those that are home ported in Hawaii and Guam, we're pushing them out further. One deployment from Guam went all the way to Australia. That's big for a 154-foot ship and a crew of 26 folks and a CO or a captain that's under the age of 30, practicing subject matter expert exchange with partner nations and fisheries operations. We are getting, at the beginning of the next fiscal year, an Indo-Pacific support cutter that will be home ported in the region. So that's big news. That's a big deal for us. That's a 270-foot cutter. It will go around throughout the region, focused on building partner capacity. And it will be in the region always. Again, that presence has been and will always be there in the region. C-130Js, we fly out of Hawaii. They do MDA, they do HADR, search and rescue type missions. We're going to experiment with rotary wing forces out of Guam, trying to get more access that way or further reach. Excess defense articles and FMF. So in terms of decommissioned Coast Guard cutters and small boats, there are about 13 cutters that are now 13 decommissioned cutters now operating in that region. There are over 100 boats that are operating there. Think about countries of Vietnam, Bangladesh, the Philippines, Sri Lanka. Our Commandant always reminds us it's not just about steel, it's people as well. People as well. So we have maritime inspectors that are out there that go to all the different partner nations. They go ahead and ensure the marine industry, the safety and security of that. That team has been there for a while, and they continue to do even more as we speak. We do all kinds of subject matter expert exchanges. So think about all those missions I just mentioned. Search and rescue, HADR, maritime law enforcement, helping set up the fisheries, legal frameworks to move forward, women, peace and security, cyber, also information sharing and MDA. On the environmental side, there's an example that's going on right now. It's great to talk about. It's bad for the people of the Philippines, but there's the motor tanker Princess Empress that sank off of Mindoro Island of the Philippines. It's a fishing economy. It's a tourist economy. There are 21,000 families in the Philippines that are impacted by this 250,000-gallon oil spill. This slick goes for about 75 miles. It's clearly having an impact. It impacted 20 marine protected areas. We have a Coast Guard commander and a small team of experts that work with these oil spills, basically leading the way. They work with DoD partners, other agencies, and I think Korea, Japan, and maybe Australia coming to help out. But this is a Coast Guard commander and a small team that is using our expertise in oil spills to help the Philippine Coast Guard respond to that. We pursue all of these operations, activities, and investments through relentless incrementalism. Little bites, trying to get at a bigger strategic goal, as the doctor was alluding to earlier. We do this with our partner nations that have that shared value for upholding maritime governance, adhering to the rule of law, and certainly modeling professional Coast Guard and maritime behaviors. So back to you. That's a lot of lists in a quick time.
Admiral Johnson, that is, first of all, fantastic news, by the way, and it's terrific to hear you talking about the Coast Guard's response to the Philippines oil spill. It was so important to show that we are answering the bell for our ally in their time of need. So I really like this phrase that you keep coming back to about exporting maritime governance, and I want to pull on that thread a little bit more and ask you to talk about the Coast Guard's efforts. Continue to expand on that about how you guys are building trusted partnerships around the Indo-Pacific to ensure the free, open, and lawful use of the maritime commons. And I'd be very curious for your thoughts as well about how the U.S. Coast Guard's approach compares with, shall we say, the approach that's being taken by the China Coast Guard. And I'd be curious also, just looking, one Coast Guard looking at another, how does the China Coast Guard stack up relative to what the international community has come to expect of how a professional Coast Guard ought to conduct itself?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. Thanks for that one. The key to our enhanced operations and our presence is that we need to focus on seeing threats and challenges through the eyes of our partners. There's no doubt about that. We need to meet them where they are with what they need, not more. We can't come in, we got to be right there where they need us and what they want us for. Usually this means not presenting a choice. That's a key part of this, not presenting a choice. It's not us or them. We provide an opportunity, we take that opportunity all to earn and become a trusted partner in that region. A great example of this is countering IUU fish, right? What I tell everybody and make sure I tell everybody, we're not targeting a particular actor. I think the group here knows that there's a big actor that's out there. We're not targeting a particular actor. We are targeting the malign activity. That's what people that govern do, right? We're against taking someone's sovereign rights, their sovereign resources away. So not at a particular actor, but at a specific malign activity. Again, this is our approach. It's upholding maritime governance. It's adhering to that rule of law. It's modeling professional Coast Guard maritime behaviors. I would say that as a trusted partner with our partner nations, we are driving towards a vision of a rule-based maritime order. And frankly, respect for international law creates an environment that is resistant to this malign activity, these efforts to actually undermine that international order. Just because you have a service that calls itself a Coast Guard and has a racing stripe on the side, just like the United States Coast Guard does, doesn't really mean anything. A Coast Guard believes and follows and sets the examples of the type of approach that I just described for you. So you asked me that question at the end, and I'm sitting here going, I don't know if there is a comparison there. So let's use an example, professional Coast Guard maritime behaviors. The U.S. Coast Guard, we adhere to cues, right? A lot of people know what cues are. Think unplanned encounters, communications back and forth to de-escalate situations. We believe in that. We practice that all the time over there, and throughout the world, for that matter. We adhere to navigation rules. We adhere to good practices of good seamanship. We adhere to rules that are combined, like the North Pacific Coast Guard Forum has combined operating procedures. We adhere to that. We adhere to our ethos. We protect, we defend, we save. All of that is grounded in maritime governance based on the rule of law. And that's where we are. And if you don't do or adhere to these types of things, well, in my mind, there is no comparison to the United States Coast Guard. So thanks for the question.
Thank you, Admiral. General Duran, Force Design 2030. A lot of the discussion around the Marine Corps' new operating concepts, like expedition advanced base operations, littoral operations in a contested environment, stand-in forces, a lot of the discussion gravitates to those concepts' implications for that high-end kinetic fight. And yet, the Commandant has repeatedly said that these concepts are not that break glass in case of war, but instead they are designed to enable Marines to compete and deter below the threshold of armed conflict. I'm hoping, can you help our audience better understand those competition phase elements of Force Design 2030 as well as its supporting concepts guiding its implementation?
Certainly, and before I begin, Hunter, thanks to you and the Navy League for setting up this panel. I'd also like to thank our allies and partners who are in the audience. We see quite a few of you out there. Many made the trip around the globe to attend this week, so we appreciate it. I feel quite humbled to be up here on this panel with some tremendously intelligent people. I'll remind everyone my call sign is simple, so I will try not to set the bar too low. I'm also a fighter pilot, so I've been brought up to make a time on target by plus or minus 10 seconds, so I'll get us back on time with this very short answer. I think your notion that the Chinese are using a maritime militia in an insurgency model is actually a unique way to look at this through a different lens than we have in the past, and it might provide opportunities in that comparison. I believe, as you know, the U.S. Navy and Marine ARG-MU teams, we deploy in and through the South China Sea routinely, and so we get to see a lot of this on a very frequent occasion. And I think the PRC-sponsored maritime militias, they operate in a way that allows them to try and push their maritime claims, potentially in an effort to gain additional scarce resources, and certainly an effort to exhaust some of their neighbors. I think some of the malign activity there is not necessarily just breaking rules in the rules-based order. It also tries to normalize the deviance and the things that are going on in that South China Sea, all in an effort to try and make that something that they raise the gains of that so that becomes almost accepted by the international community. Using your insurgency model, I think you'll see that those are things that a ground-based insurgency would also attempt to do in an albeit slightly different way. But as a counterinsurgency, it's not always a military solution. It is a whole of government solution. Normally requires a political end. But I do think that from the military perspective, the Marine Corps brings a few unique opportunities and capabilities that we use in addition to the rest of government, and certainly we always do that by, with, and through our allies and partners. Again, back to the counterinsurgency model, anytime you're working against an insurgency, the first thing you need is actionable intelligence and information. And from the Marine Corps' Force Design 2030, our stand-in force in the form of the Marine Littoral Regiment, that unit has organic capabilities to sense and make sense. They can see what's out there. They can help build the picture for the fleet commander of the maritime domain awareness, and that provides kind of step one in that counterinsurgency model, if you will. Over to step two. For step two, you need to get the trust of the local population anytime you are fighting an insurgency. And our trust from a local population comes in the form of being side by side with our allies and partners. Again, going back to our Navy and Marine ARG-MU teams who are always forward deployed, again, right next to our partners and allies. But additionally, it's a scalable unit that can be used across the realm of military operations. It can be humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, but what it does is it provides a little bit of faith in our partners and our allies that we're gonna be there with them. And so perhaps they can take a little bit more of a harder stance towards some of these maritime militias and the malignant activities that they may be doing. And then finally, any insurgency, it takes patience. And so for that patience, I think having Marines aboard expeditionary vessels on expeditionary bases that are forward, next to our allies and partners, That, again, allows us the staying power because virtual presence is actual absence, and so you have to be there. And so as a service, we keep about 30,000 Marines forward to the international date line aboard ships, as well as aboard Expeditionary Advanced Bases. And so that's kind of how we are trying to tackle this project. But Force Design 2030 is not just about changing a little bit of kit. It is a modernization of the entire Marine Corps. In addition to the Force Design 2030, many of the other proposals, EABO, the stand-in force, recon, counter-recon, we've just recently come out with a Training and Education Command 2030. We, of course, have Talent Management 2030, and then just 2 weeks ago, Installations and Logistics 2030. So again, we are attempting to modernize the entire force to continue to keep pace with what the Congress and what the nation needs its Marine Corps to do every day.
Thank you very much, General. Now, several of the articles in the Maritime Coin Project have drawn insights from the Marine Corps' rich history of working alongside local allies and partners. And a case study that comes up in a number of articles, including Dr. Holmes's, as well as there's an excellent piece by called Stand-in Forces, the role of stand-in forces in Maritime Coin in the July issue. And a more recent one about looking at the MLR and how you might transform that into an integrated maritime force alongside the Navy and the Coast Guard in the December issue. A lot of these authors are gravitating towards the case study of the Combined Action Program that the Marine Corps applied very successfully in Vietnam and then became the model on which the counter-ISIL campaign was modeled more recently. And you personally were involved in a version of combined action in the maritime domain when you led the Marine Corps contingent of F-35Bs as part of the UK Carrier Strike Group's deployment in 2021 to the Indo-Pacific. Could you talk a bit about that experience and more broadly talk about how the Marines are working alongside their local allies and partners and looking to integrate those capabilities through things like exercises and whatnot?
Absolutely. I think I'd get kicked out of the Marine Corps if I compared my deployment that had bars on board to the Combined Action Program in Vietnam. But I can speak to our deployment with the HMS Queen Elizabeth Carrier Strike Group in 2021. I saw the second Sea Lord out there in the audience, so thank you, sir, for allowing me to spend 7 months on your lovely ship. But what we did is it took about 10 years to do this. We got together. It was a huge effort from the U.S. Navy, the United States Marine Corps, the Royal Navy, the Royal Air Force. And the culmination was we ended up with an Arleigh Burke destroyer, USS the Sullivans, as well as a Marine F-35B squadron, VMFA 211. They took 10 aircraft, and then the Sullivans always came across for the workups prior to deployment starting in September of 2020. And then the deployment began in May of 21 with a pre-deployment certification exercise. But what you had is you had a strike group from the United Kingdom formed around HMS Queen Elizabeth, so about 65,000-ton aircraft carrier, had 16 F-35Bs and several Merlin helicopters on board. And it had 8 escort ships. One of those happened to be USS the Sullivans, but we also had a frigate from the Netherlands. It was Evertsen. And so this strike group went 40,000 miles, so from Portsmouth all the way to Guam and back, interacted with 40 different nations. In the East Mediterranean, we had intercepts for the course of almost 2 weeks by the Russian Federated Air Force, as well as being monitored by the Russian Navy. And then we did tour through the South China Sea twice going through there. The second time coming back, interestingly, we did 4 carrier operations with the Japanese carrier ISA. We had the Carl Vinson. We also had the America coming back through, and then we followed the Carl Vinson back through the South China Sea. And I think, interestingly, the thing I took away from it was, one, there was a very unique command structure associated with it. I was the senior national representative, so I was operationally and tactically assigned to the Geographic Combatant Commander, and that was delegated to the Numbered Fleet Commander. So Vice Admiral Black was my boss, and he reminded me of that on many occasions today. But the units were OPCON to the Numbered Fleet Commander, but they were take-on to the UK Carrier Strike Group. We actually conducted combat operations over Syria and Iraq from that vessel. And then I think the greatest thing from an ally and partner perspective is, in addition to working with 40 other nations, it was, I think, so interesting for me to see a UK Carrier Strike Group, and everywhere we went, whether that was in the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, South China Sea, Phil Sea, Pacific, vessels from other nations would just routinely join in with this strike group. And to see them just seamlessly integrate, I think that's our biggest strength. And I think, one of our asymmetric advantages is our relationship with our allies and partners. But I also think the way that we are interoperable and in some cases interchangeable, that becomes something of concern to many, of our other peer competitors who might have malign activities or desires against us. And so I think it was a great example of how, like-minded nations can come together, demonstrate, the freedom of sea, freedom of navigation all around the world globally, and do it in a very peaceful way while bringing in many other nations.
Thank you very much, General. Daz Dawson, the State Department has had this close and symbiotic relationship with the sea services going back to our nation's founding. In this current environment of strategic competition, how can the sea services best support the State Department diplomacy, as well as the State Department's Indo-Pacific strategy?
Thank you, Hunter, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I think the first thing to note is that the challenges and opportunities in the Indo-Pacific region, the challenges that are presented for American security and prosperity truly require both a whole of government and a whole of society approach to addressing the challenge. And that is why the administration's Indo-Pacific strategy brings together the diplomatic, defense, and development tools into one coordinated effort that adds up to more than the sum of its parts. The Indo-Pacific strategy, as I'm sure you all know, is the administration's affirmative vision for the region. And the very origin of that strategy, which was first coined by former Japanese PM Shinzo Abe, was in fact rooted in connecting two oceans and in promoting a free and open maritime order. And the Indo-Pacific strategy builds on that core idea. We speak about it in shorthand by referring to the 5 pillars as free and open, connected, prosperous, secure, and resilient. And the sea services are, of course, an indispensable element of that effort. And that includes things such as executing freedom of navigation operations, providing training and capacity building, working to tackle transnational threats, all of those things. These all demonstrate that the United States is fully committed to working with our friends, allies, and partners to deliver the tangible impact and tangible support they need. All of those things lend tremendous weight to our diplomatic efforts. And our diplomatic efforts are focused on building up the lattice work of mutually reinforcing partnerships and groupings that bring together the collective capacity to tackle these really defining challenges of our time. So for our part at the State Department, we work to provide our interagency partners with the diplomatic platforms and access and insights that are necessary in order to determine what the whole of interagency and society can and should be doing in and with the region. And we lead the diplomatic engagement with our partners, both bilaterally and also in minilateral and multilateral groupings that enables that cooperation. In terms of our diplomatic platforms, I note that we are actively working to expand our platforms. We have just recently opened a new embassy in the Solomon Islands. We are hard at work to open an embassy in the Maldives, and we are in the midst of discussions on new embassies for Vanuatu, Kiribati, and Tonga. Additionally, we're working to expand our staffing at all of our existing embassies and consulates. And this all speaks to the importance and the symbiosis of working across the interagency. I think that the results that we've seen just in the past few months show that we're making great progress. We had the AUKUS leaders announcement about the pathway forward. We had the designation of 4 new enhanced defense cooperation sites with the Philippines. We had another successful iteration of Cobra Gold in Thailand, and the first US-EU joint naval exercise off the coast of Oman, which was a result of the US-EU Indo-Pacific consultations. So looking ahead, I would just say that we'll continue to use our combined efforts to deliver even greater impact across the region. And we'll be looking to do that through initiatives such as the Indo-Pacific Partnership for Maritime Domain Awareness and the Partners in the Blue Pacific Initiative.
Outstanding. Now, Des Dawson, your office has been playing a key role in some of those I find very exciting diplomatic initiatives that you just mentioned. And among them, the recent expansion of cooperation with the Philippines. You mentioned EDCA, Quad efforts on maritime domain awareness, and deepening cooperation with Pacific Island nations. Can you share more about how are you thinking about the role of the sea services in supporting your office's efforts in expanding our maritime partnerships, and what role can the State Department play in turn in supporting the sea services, not just in expanding those partnerships, but also in broadening the access available to our naval and maritime forces in competition below or in conflict?
Great, thank you. I'm glad you mentioned all of those things. So speaking about the Quad, which I'm sure you all are all well aware, is the partnership between the US, India, Japan, and Australia. You may know that just last week, we at the State Department hosted an in-person meeting of the Quad Maritime Working Group, and that brought together all of our Quad partners to engage in that discussion, along with representatives from think tanks and other experts. Part of the discussion there was focused on the IPMDA initiative, Indo-Pacific Partnership for Maritime Domain Awareness, and that's really focused on enhancing the picture that our partners have in their waters to better enable them to counter things like dark shipping, IUU fishing, issues that fundamentally impact their economy. And we also, when we think about the role that sea services can provide in that space, want to look beyond the traditional security space into things like humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. We are also working with and through the Quad to establish a humanitarian assistance and disaster relief framework for the region. With respect to the Pacific Islands, the Partners in the Blue Pacific Initiative, there is great potential there to offer support for our Pacific partners. The key is that we need to work with and through the Pacific Islands and their regional architecture to understand their needs and to respond to the priorities that they identify. And all of the Pacific Partners in the Blue Pacific countries had the opportunity to come together with our Pacific Island partners in January in Hawaii to listen to and to better understand what some of those priorities are so that we can work jointly to design solutions. And then just lastly, on the Philippines, I was just in the Philippines a couple of weeks ago and was really encouraged by the strength of the relationship at this moment. our agreement on EDCA, which I mentioned earlier, will provide both the U.S. and Philippine sea services with greater ability and agility to work together to tackle these challenges that the Philippines sees in their exclusive economic zone and throughout the broader South China Sea. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daz Dawson. So I know we're getting close to time. Julia has given me permission to go 5 minutes over, so we can, because this has been an absolutely phenomenal discussion. So I have two questions I want to ask to the panel as a whole. So the first one, so we're going to, this kind of rapid fire mode here. So the first question is, what would you like to see us prioritize in order to enable greater success for the United States and our allies in maritime competition, and including things that maybe haven't received the attention that they deserve? And Daz Dawson, why don't we start with you?
Okay, well, the thing that I am going to talk about is one that is very obvious but clearly needs great attention, and that is resourcing. We need the resourcing for the State Department and for the Indo-Pacific strategy as a whole in order to effectively advance our objectives. That includes everything from the resourcing to build new embassies, as noted, to expand our staffing and to provide the foreign assistance, security assistance, and public diplomacy programs that will enable us to advance our objectives. And just the other point that I would mention is that the information space is critically important. That brings me back to the need for resourcing for our public diplomacy efforts. But we know that through our public diplomacy experts and through foreign opinion polling, that we need to deliver a positive and affirmative, truth-based narrative about what the United States and our partners and allies can deliver to the region so that we can fill the narrative void that our adversaries seek to create.
Thank you. Admiral Black.
I think two things jump right to mind. You heard Simple refer to what the Marine Corps does. There's no better team than the Navy and Marine Corps team. And then Vice Admiral Chongson really hit on the Coast Guard. The three of us have to be able to operate together at every level in many, many locations to really press in the presence and the capability to interact where the nation can receive us. And then I think the last piece would be that's got to expand to partners as well, because when you bring this kind of sea service capability together, it attracts partners of every capability level, and so you can really meet them where it is the most impactful.
Thank you. Admiral Tiongson.
That was great. Completely agree with it. I think I'll just expand a little bit and say, if you want to keep that maritime domain safe, secure, prosperous, all those great words, connected, resilient, and open, it does require that unity of effort. It's a collective will to do that. I think Coast Guards, as I defined earlier, could be a great help in that endeavor. So all we can do, and we've already been tasked to do it, but to help build up those Coast Guards is right on point. And that's what I put my plug in for. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. General Duran.
Yeah, thanks, Hunter. I'd like to build on Vice Admiral Black's point. I think, we all know we have the greatest Navy that the world has ever seen. We want to have the greatest combination of naval power that the world has ever seen. And the way we need to do that is we need to work to the greatest extent possible to reduce the classification of as much information so that we can share so much more with our allies and partners. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Holmes.
I guess here in the lightning round, I guess I would put in a plug for culture. I think that big institutions they're like machines. In fact, salesmen for them reaching all the way back to the heyday of public administration in the late 19th century will tell you that they are machines. They basically have a repertoire of tasks that they issue that they basically perform over and over again in the same way each time, much like a production line mentality. And I think that, trying to, and in fact, I've been totally stoked by what I've heard here in the last hour. I mean, I think this is the kind of culture that we need to be worked for if we want to have resources, if we want to instill the habits, basically the ethos of working together across joint and multinational lines. I think that's really the task for all of us, and especially for those of you in uniform and in policy-making roles, to actually take that on board and try to instill that ethos in the interagency, in the State Department, Commerce Department, and obviously the military services and the U.S. Coast Guard. Simply because I think everything is downstream of there, and if we get the culture right, chances are the resource, the material aspect, and the human aspects of competition will follow.
Wonderful, thank you. Now, taking those extra 5 minutes, last question. What would you like your joint and interagency partners to be thinking about and keep in mind in order to create greater opportunities for collaboration, cooperation, and capability integration across the tri-service and across the interagency? Des Dawson, we'll start again with you.
Great, thank you. Well, this has already been referenced, but I think it is critically important that we ask for and factor in the input of our partners in the region before we seek to jump to or identify solutions. We really need to understand the needs and priorities, and then we need to coordinate both across the USG interagency and with our like-minded partners to create the full picture of what is most critically needed, what has to be prioritized among that list, and when and where we can most effectively deliver it. In that manner, we can avoid oversaturating any one country that may not have the ability to absorb what we're trying to do, or overly focusing on one issue while leaving many other things unaddressed. So I would sum it up by saying we need communication and we need coordination.
Thank you. Admiral Black.
As you would expect, the diplomat had said it far better than the sailor. So I'm going to steal all of her brilliant words and say, amen.
Admiral Tiongson.
We're going to go 3 for 3. And this is great. I didn't call it a coordinator, but I called it a synchronizer. We have listed a lot of operations, activities, and investments right here up on this panel, whether it's done. But you said it best when you said it's a whole of government, a whole of society. I always look to find out, okay, so who is coordinating, who is synchronizing, how can I build off of somebody else's effort to really have that impact? I don't know, I've been in the job for about 7 months. I'm still looking for that entity to help put those words in the Indo-Pacific strategy to measure. And it's not just us. I talk with the 7th, 3rd Fleet, 1 MEF, 3 MEF folks. We talk a lot, but it's much larger than right here. It is that whole government, whole society. That's enough.
Thank you. General Duran?
Certainly, Hunter. Yeah, I'll never pass up the opportunity to get to talk. 3 weeks ago, I was down in Chile talking to their naval forces, and they had just had a fleet of 400 Chinese fishing ships go through the Strait of Magellan from the Pacific to the Atlantic and back. And I think a little interagency love, if you will, down in South America might also go a long way, because this is not just a regional issue, this is a global issue. These maritime militias and fishing fleets, they're not just restricted to the South China Sea. And I think that, it might not be too long before we find the first island chain encompassing Latin America as well. So I think that's a way in the future that we might get more interagency cooperation to help some of our closest partners down there that, may need just a little bit of assistance.
Thank you very much. Dr. Holmes, take us out.
Okay, why don't I kick it up a level, extra abstraction from what we've heard, all of which I entirely agree with. I mean, think about it when we're trying to get different bodies of people. I mean, that's what institutions and societies are, to work together towards common goals. Think about it as an alliance. It's an alliance. We talk about our allies and our friends and so forth. We're talking about basically billiard balls trying to get nations to work together for common goals. I started off life as a mathematician, and when I think about how to get that sort of combined effort, it reminds me of vector mechanics. I mean, think about it when you have different institutions that have somewhat different goals, they attach somewhat different importance to them, and certainly have different resources to apply to them. It's really, really hard to get that vector to resolve in a common magnitude and direction pointing towards that common goal. So think about it not only just in terms of institutions, but also in terms of the people, the government, and the society. I mean, the elements of any society, the people, the government, and the military, but also in terms of foreign people's governments and militaries and so forth. So I think that provides a way. If you think about the idea of jointness and inter-service and also interagency cooperation in those terms, that gives us a way to try to figure out how to do this, how to get us all take part in a cohesive effort towards what we've been talking about, which is all about competing short of war.
Thank you very much. Our sincere thanks to our fantastic panelists for sharing their very candid thoughts here today, and wishing you all a wonderful sea air space. Thank you.